Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr Comyn and Mr Jones, for being here this morning.
Pleasure.
Are you aware of what's happened to Qantas as reputation in the last few months?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Now, you're a bank, you represent a bank, Mr Comyn, which provides financial services, and cash is fundamental to those for many, many people. People are afraid of cash. Whether you agree with that or not, they are afraid of cash, and they're increasing their use of cash. Your costs and services are considered, from your statement, I concluded that they're considered as part of, reviewed annually, you said, but are you considering the whole service, what people really expect from your bank?
Yes, absolutely. We consider the whole service.
90% of your customers, more than 90% of your customers, stay after a bank closure.
Yes.
So your customers are sticky?
Yes.
Okay.
It could be perceived a slightly different way as well, which is the role of a physical branch in some customers' minds perhaps isn't as important as it was. Now, I sort of agree with that, and I think it very much depends on different customers. But I think a range of different conclusions can be drawn from that. Yes,
I agree with you. But the fact is your customers are sticky, and so are other bank customers. So your cross-subsidisation, you mentioned cross-subsidisation of electronic customers on cash is $40 per customer.
What I said was we've calculated that we think the cost of providing cash, and I believe providing cash will be important, will continue to be important. It's an important issue. I suspect we pay a significant proportion of the costs of providing cash in Australia. I don't say that as a complaint. I say it more as a statement of fact. We serve about 10 million customers. It works out to be about $40. The reality is, like anything, there's a small proportion of customers who use cash very often. There's a much larger proportion who don't use it at all, and there'd be somewhere in between who are using it infrequently. Across that, I'm not exactly sure I understand by the point you made about afraid of cash.
Sorry?
You said, I think you said earlier on in your questions that Australians are afraid of cash. Did I mishear you?
Sorry, they're afraid of losing cash.
Oh,
Thank you for picking me up on that. That's a very important point. They're afraid of losing cash. We've seen the digital identity mooted by the Morrison government, now raised by the Labor government. A bill that was introduced not into Parliament as such for processing, but into the public debate in Parliament last year. We've seen the attempts to limit the cash ban bill, and that people are scared, especially after losing a lot of their fundamental freedoms in the last 3 years under the COVID mismanagement. They're worried very much about being controlled in all aspects of their lives. How much has your bank spent on digital expansion that cash customers did not ask for?
It'd be very difficult for me to answer that because we haven't asked every one of those 10 million customers. But
no, I understand that.
But I think we could reasonably assume with let's say in our retail bank, the CommBank App, which is our mobile banking app, we have more than 8 million users. On average, they log in 39 times per month. It's clearly one of the most important, if not the most important, feature that customers use. So I'd say that clearly the vast majority of customers highly value the investments that we make in it, both in terms of hopefully helping it make it easier for them to manage their financial lives, but also, as Senator White was asking, to make sure it's the safest and secure and most resilient experience possible.
So we'll come back to cash in a minute, but you just said you've got a commitment to cash.
I believe cash will continue to be available for many years within Australia. I don't think people should fear that cash is going to be removed from circulation.
Is that your commitment or is it just your belief?
Well, I mean, I can only make the commitment on behalf of the Commonwealth Bank.
That's what I mean.
We certainly have no plans to remove cash distribution or the provision of cash in Australia. I don't think that that's feasible, and I don't think that would be desirable, certainly in the foreseeable future.
Okay, let's turn to Australia Post, and we'll come back to cash. How much do you pay Australia Post for the community representation fee? Not the transaction, but the community representation fee.
I mentioned in the introduction that it's tens of millions of dollars. I know I'm protected by parliamentary privilege. Would you mind if I checked whether there's any commercial.
Take it on notice.
Yeah, I mean, I know what the
figures.
number is. I don't have any difficulty
Yep.
sharing it with you, but I probably should check that.
I think usually the best idea is take it on notice. Mr. Comyn, you can provide that information to us.
So is your concern, Mr. Comyn, one of the figure or of releasing it?
Well, I'd say I'm not personally concerned with either of those dimensions, but I probably, since it's a contract that's entered into between the Commonwealth Bank and Australia Post, I just want to double-check if there's any contractual restrictions, and probably out of courtesy, let Australia Post know.
So it was released in 2018 as being $22 million for all the banks. Sorry, for each bank.
It's more than that.
Okay. So you're currently flooding Australia Post with work. You, when I say you, not just the Commonwealth Bank, but all banks, because you're closing branches in the regional areas. Australia Post is getting flooded with customers. Is it more than 22 million?
The totality of what we pay Australia Post? Yes, it is. And again, look, not to get caught up in the semantics, I wouldn't characterise it as flooding. Clearly, customers, and we pay on a per-transaction basis to Australia Post with an extension out beyond 2030. We entered into a long-term contract to give Australia Post and some of those individual franchisees certainty. And, I mean, we meet, I know Mark does, regularly with Australia Post to talk about are there opportunities for us to continue to improve the service, to be able to support Australia Post, serve customers better, to make sure that there's as many transaction types that are available in Australia Post to ensure the convenience is as high as possible.
So you're treating them as a partner?
Yes.
Okay. Just come back to the structure of the banking system in this country, especially the big four banks, Mr. Comyn. There is protection for the banks if the banks go overboard in risk or the economy collapses. You've got protection in the bank bail-in, which is legislated, I think, in 2018. And that was confirmed to me by a Treasury official, senior Treasury official, just 2 years ago. You've had props from the government in the past, government guarantees for things like overseas borrowing. You've got a regulatory support, enormous regulatory support. 4 pillars for a start is a regulatory support. You've got more generous treatment from APRA, for example, in risk weighting. You've got barriers to entry that the regulations provide for the Big Four, protecting the Big Four. You've got legal barriers, or I shouldn't say legal barriers, you've got a barrier that's legal because in the sense that you've got deep pockets and you can fund enormous defences in lawsuits that are brought against you. I've seen this from first-hand from when I chaired the Senate Select Inquiry into lending to primary production customers. You dominate the cash distribution network. You're essentially now, as a result of the support from the community and the governments, a low-risk business. And your customers are sticky. That's a hell of a ride.
I mean, I would challenge, I think, just about every one of the assumptions that you made then, but I'm not exactly sure where that would get us. But, yeah, I definitely wouldn't characterise it in the terms and the context that you did. Are we heavily regulated? Absolutely. Is there a lot of investment required to manage and appropriately respond to that regulation? Yes, there is. Do I think significant financial institutions in Australia and others should be heavily regulated? Absolutely. Do I think it's important that Australian banks and the Commonwealth Bank have unquestionably strong levels of capital? Absolutely, because we're big importers of capital, and the success of economies and financial institutions are necessarily very intertwined. But, I mean, I can give you multiple examples, but I don't know how helpful it would be. But even if you think about sort of capital levels, Australian banks hold considerably more capital than many other financial institutions and jurisdictions. And in a policy setting, I think that's absolutely appropriate. But to help make the numbers real, that costs across the major banks per annum between $7 and $11 billion. So, I mean, I'd characterise a lot of things differently. I think sometimes the term funding facilities described in a way that's not necessarily matched by our experience.
So I acknowledge your view, okay, and I point to the fact that every monopoly in the world, and I'm not accusing you of being a monopoly, every monopoly in the world is there as a result of government. So you've got a low-risk business. Your ownership of the Commonwealth Bank, a significant controlling portion, includes Vanguard Group, BlackRock, I'm reading from your registry, BlackRock Fund Advisors, Vanguard Investments, Norges Bank, Goody, Capital Management, BlackRock Advisors, Vanguard Global Advisors, and a couple more in there. Now, when I look at the other three big banks, they're almost identical. There's significant controlling interest. So what it seems to me is we've got one bank with 4 logos. One bank with 4 logos. And that's a very tight business, tight industry. You hide behind the regulations, I put it to you. But when I was chairing that Senate Select Inquiry into lending to primary production customers, I saw the services almost identical from each of the banks. The strategies almost identical. The disregard for customers almost identical. The hiding behind regulations, and regulations are there to protect you, your bank. That's the way I see it in practice. Almost identical across all 4 banks. Now, directors appoint you, I take it, and your directors are appointed by the likes of BlackRock, Vanguard, First State, State Street. The banking sector with the 4 big banks seems to be a very cosy club, and you can do whatever you want with very sticky customers. Is that correct?
No, it's not, Senator. Again, look, maybe where to start. The shareholder base, I think, is quite different to the way you outline, and I think there's quite significant differences even across the major banks. We're an extremely widely held retail stock, so we'd have approximately 50% of our shareholders is held directly by retail onshore shareholders. Obviously, that's a result of...
Excuse me, Mr Comyn, how many of those shareholders vote?
Well, every one of them is entitled to vote.
How many of them vote?
I couldn't give you the exact number, but one thing I would say, Senator Roberts, is, and clearly I meet with institutional shareholders. I just came back from meeting with some institutional shareholders internationally. I can assure you I get stopped and asked about the performance, profitability, questions on people's minds, the dividend by a lot more retail shareholders than I ever do from international. But if you'll let me finish, just to finish quickly on the shareholder base, more than 50% would be direct to retail. The next approximately 30% would be institutional but domestic, primarily through superannuation, some of the biggest industry and superannuation funds. We actually have quite a small representation internationally. You mentioned some of them. There's a mixture of both. You touched on some are index funds. Some have a variety of different mandates from either the US, North America and within Asia. But fundamentally, if the Commonwealth Bank is profitable, 75% approximately of our profits go to our shareholders, predominantly Australian families, more than 12 million. And I can assure you, based on my experience, they absolutely do value it. I'm not sure the point you were making on regulation either. Obviously, we work very closely with regulators. They play a
The point I was making was that regulations help you because they give you protection. No one else. It's very difficult for a small borrower to take you on legally, and the regulations are such a maze.
I'm going to have to rotate the call, but Mr Comyn, if you want to briefly respond to that, if you want to, it's up to you. And then I need to give other senators.
In the interest of time.
Okay. Sorry, Senator Roberts, we do have limited time.